The letter lay on the counter of the shop in Aldersgate Street on a Thursday morning in April, and it was addressed to no one. Delia had written it in the hour before Mrs. Fitch arrived, in the cold quiet before the spring light came fully through the window, and she had not sealed it, because sealing it would have implied a recipient, and she had not allowed herself one. She had written it for the same reason she had always written the best letters in the shop, the ones she rewrote long after the client had left, and the commission had been paid. She had written it because the words had nowhere else to go. She did not expect him to read it. She did not expect him to come. What she expected, on that Thursday morning in April, was the ordinary wait of a London season continuing without her in it, a season that had never contained her and did not propose to begin. She was 23 years old. She had been employed at Mrs. Fitch's letter-writing establishment near Cheapside for 14 months, at 12 shillings a week, and she was very good at it. That was the entirety of what the season knew about her. To understand how a letter left on a counter on a Thursday morning could undo the machinery of an English spring, it is necessary to understand first what sort of woman Delia Hartwell was, and second what sort of man Lord Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, believed himself to be when he walked through the shop door on the 2nd of March and asked for a letter to be written. Delia was the daughter of a clergyman who had died owing £43 to a bookseller and 7 shillings to a seamstress, and she had settled both debts herself before she left Shropshire. She was tall and plainly dressed, with the kind of face that required good light and a second look, and she had learned early that most people gave neither. She had attended a dame school in the village until she was 9, and after that she had taught herself from her father's library, which meant she had read more moral philosophy and rather less fashionable verse than any other young woman writing letters for hire in the city of London. The education had given her 2 gifts that were, in the context of the season's machinery, almost equally useless. She could perceive what a person was actually trying to say beneath what they believed they were saying, and she could not, when it mattered, pretend otherwise. Mrs. Fitch had hired her on the strength of a sample letter Delia had written on the spot, asked to produce a sympathy note for a widow who had quarreled with her sister-in-law. The note Delia produced had been, according to Mrs. Fitch, the best thing she had read in 17 years of running a letter shop, because it had been honest about grief without being maudlin, warm without being familiar, and it had said the thing the widow actually needed to say, rather than the thing the widow thought she was paying to have said. Mrs. Fitch was a practical woman who charged 6pence above the standard rate for Delia's letters and told every client that the additional 6pence was for the second draft, which was not entirely untrue. The shop was not in Mayfair. It was not in a street that the quality frequented, or that the quality would have acknowledged frequenting if asked. It occupied a ground-floor room in a terrace between a chandler and a printer, and its clients were mostly tradespeople, servants writing home, young men who had fallen into debt and needed to explain themselves to fathers, and occasionally a widow who needed the words for something her grief had made too large to manage alone. The Duke of Ashmore arrived on the 2nd of March at 10:30 in the morning. He did not announce his title. He gave his name as Mr. Vane, set a sheet of paper on the counter without looking at Delia directly, and said he required a letter sent to the governors of a boys' school in Dorset regarding the disbursement of a charitable endowment. His voice was level and precise, with the particular flatness of a man who had trained himself not to inflect. He was 34 years old, though he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man older than that, the way people move when they are afraid of what a sudden gesture might cost them. Delia read the draft he had brought. It was the coldest letter she had encountered in 14 months of reading other people's attempts at communication. It was correct in every legal and financial particular, naming the sum of £200 per annum to be divided among 6 scholars of limited means, specifying the criteria for selection and the mechanism of quarterly disbursement. It was without a single word that would have led the governors of the school, or the 6 scholars, or anyone who ever encountered it, to understand that the man who had written the draft had felt anything when he wrote it. She could not send it as it stood. This was not, she told herself, her business. Her business was to copy the draft in a clean hand, take the commission, and say nothing. She revised it anyway. She kept every particular intact. She changed 11 words. She shifted the order of 2 sentences, so that the one naming the scholars came before the one naming the sum, rather than after it. She added a single clause at the close that acknowledged, without sentiment and without explanation, that the governors would understand the intent of the gift better than the letter could convey it. When she handed it across the counter, Edmund read it standing up. He did not speak for a long moment. He took the letter, paid the commission without dispute, and left. Delia told herself she had done nothing out of the ordinary. A good letter said what it meant. That was the whole of her function. He returned the following Tuesday. He returned ostensibly to correct an error in the address, which was not an error. He stood at the counter with the returned letter in his hand, looked at Delia for the first time with something that was not the careful flatness of his first visit, and said that she had changed his letter. "I corrected the letter you brought me," Delia said. "The one you wrote was accurate. The one I sent will be understood." He did not reply immediately. The silence was the kind that felt like an argument being constructed. "There is a difference," he said at last, "between what a letter conveys and what it intends." "There ought not to be," Delia said. He left the letter on the counter. He came back the following Thursday. By the second week of March, Delia had begun to understand that his returns were not about the letters, even as she refused to allow herself to dwell on what they might be about instead. He commissioned a second letter, this one addressed to the chaplain of his estate in Wiltshire, thanking the man for an act of pastoral care that the draft described in 3 formally correct lines, and that Delia expanded, with Edmund's grudging permission, to 7. He watched her write it. That was the word for what he did. He did not stand at the counter and look out the window or examine the shelf of sealing waxes while he waited. He stood at the counter and watched her hand move across the page. She was aware of being watched. She was aware of it in the way one is aware of a change in the weather before the sky gives it away, a slight shift in the quality of the air in the room, a warmth along the side of her face that she could not attribute to the window. She said nothing about it. It was Mrs. Fitch who noticed first that the Duke of Ashmore was not, strictly speaking, Mr. Vane. Mrs. Fitch had been in business near Cheapside for 17 years and had a talent for recognizing quality that had nothing to do with social aspiration and everything to do with the observation of boot leather, which was never wrong. She told Delia privately, on a Wednesday afternoon after Edmund had collected the chaplain's letter and departed, that she did not know what a man of that particular quality of boot leather wanted with a letter shop in Aldersgate Street, but that she intended to charge him appropriately if he came back. He came back. He came back on a Friday with a 3rd commission, and on this occasion he did not bring a draft. He stood at the counter and described what the letter needed to do without specifying to whom it was to be addressed or from whom it was to appear to come. The letter, he said, was for a child, and it needed to explain an absence in terms a child could bear to read. Delia put down her pen. She looked at him directly, which she had learned in 14 months to do sparingly, because the quality did not always understand that a direct look from a woman employed in a trade was a professional engagement rather than a social one. Edmund did not misunderstand it. He returned the look with the particular stillness that was. She had begun to understand, not coldness at all, but containment. The way a body holds itself together when movement would cost too much. "How old is the child?" she said. A pause. The quality of the pause told her more than most people's full sentences. 7, he said. 8 in the autumn. And who has been absent? Another pause. His hands rested on the counter, very still. She noticed, for the first time, that the knuckle of his left thumb showed a faint white scar, the kind that comes from a sharp edge and mends without complaint. "The child's father," Edmund said, "for the better part of a year." Delia picked up her pen. She would think about that exchange afterward. In the evenings when the shop was closed, and Mrs. Fitch had gone upstairs and the city settled into its night noises, she would think about the way he had said "the child's father," rather than "I," and what it cost a man to speak of himself in the third person when the subject was absence and a child waiting to understand it. She would think about the piano she had not yet seen, which he had mentioned once in passing, telling her that the boy had left a piece of music open on the stand in the study that Edmund had not been able to close. She understood then, without his having told her, what the first letter had been for. The endowment to the boys' school. £200 per annum, divided among 6 scholars of limited means. She understood that it had not been a charitable impulse, but a specific act, the kind of grief does when it cannot stop itself from continuing to provide. His son had died the previous spring. Edmund had not said so. He would not say so. What he had done was return to a letter shop near Cheapside on 4 consecutive occasions and argue with a woman who corrected his prose, because the arguing required him to be present, and being present had become, somewhere in the previous 12 months, the hardest possible task. That was the wound. It had been there from the beginning, in the flatness of his voice and the carefulness of his hands, and the 3 seconds he took before answering any question that touched it. Delia had seen it the way she saw most things, clearly, and without announcing her seeing, and she had written the letter to the boy as carefully as she had ever written anything, because it was the first letter Edmund Vane had needed rather than commissioned. She had charged him the standard rate. He had not argued about it. He had folded the letter without reading it in the shop, which was the only time he had done so, and he had left with it inside his coat, near the place where a man keeps things he is not ready to examine in public. It was at this point, midway through March, that Lady Sophronia Vane became aware that her son was visiting a letter shop near Cheapside. Sophronia had been the Duchess of Ashmore for 31 years before she became the Dowager, and she wore the distinction of Dowager with the composed authority of a woman who understood that the title had changed, but the substance had not. She was 60 years old, impeccably dressed, and organized around a principle that the world had, so far, done very little to challenge. The principle was that the correct order of things required the correct people to occupy the correct positions, and that people who could not demonstrate the appropriate credentials for the position they were approaching should be assisted, gently but firmly, back to the position from which they had come. Edmund was 34. The title had been his for 3 years, and the matter of the succession was one Sophronia discussed openly at the beginning of the season, with the confidence of a woman whose position entitled her to discuss it. She had identified Miss Cecily Hargrove as the appropriate candidate before the second ball of the season. Cecily was 21, pretty in a bright, specific way, well-bred, and thoroughly scripted, which Sophronia regarded as a virtue rather than a limitation. A woman who knew her script did not revise other people's letters. Sophronia learned of the shop from her own footman, who had observed Edmund's carriage on Aldersgate Street on 2 separate mornings. She made inquiries, which was a thing she did with the efficiency of long practice. The inquiries produced the information she needed. A letter shop, a tradesperson's premises near Cheapside, a young woman employed there, a clergyman's daughter from Shropshire, earning 12 shillings a week. A paid scribbler, Sophronia said to her companion, Mrs. Hollis, in the privacy of her drawing room, with the ease of a woman naming a category rather than a person. One gathers she has made herself useful to him in some capacity. It is no great matter. She said it at a dinner at Lady Dunmore's table 3 days later, with rather more precision and rather more company. Ashmore has discovered a letter shop, apparently, a paid scribbler of some kind near Cheapside. One assumes it is a passing curiosity. Men of his position require some occupation for their restlessness. The remark crossed the table in the way such remarks did, which was quickly and without resistance. Delia did not hear it that evening. She heard its echo 10 days later. From a young woman who came into the shop to have a letter copied and mentioned, with the careless goodwill of someone reporting an entertainment rather than an injury, that she had heard Lord Ashmore had taken to employing a letter girl. A paid scribbler, she said pleasantly, turning the phrase over like a halfpenny. How terribly modern. Delia copied the letter she had been brought, quoted the standard rate, and said nothing. Mrs. Fitch, who had been standing in the doorway between the shop and the back room and had heard everything, waited until the client left. Then she said, in her direct, practical way, that she was sorry, and that she was also raising the additional surcharge on Delia's letters to 1 shilling, because the market supported it. It was not quite comfort. It was better than comfort, in the way that practical acts of loyalty often are. Edmund came in the following morning. He had no commission. He stood at the counter for a moment with the kind of silence that was not the absence of speech, but the presence of something not yet ready to become speech. And then he said, very directly, that he understood she had been spoken of in a manner that was not accurate, and that he was sorry for it. Delia looked at him. The room was very quiet. People say a great many things that are not accurate, she said. I have written enough letters on their behalf to know it. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but had something of laughter's shape in it. It was the first time she had heard anything like it from him, and it arrived with the weight of something rare, the way the first warm day of spring arrives with the accumulated credit of the entire winter behind it. He left without a commission. He stood for a moment in the doorway, and she noticed, because she noticed everything in the room when he was in it, that his hand rested briefly on the doorframe before he released it and went out. The witnessing happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of March, on a morning when the weather had turned back to cold after a deceptive few days of warmth, and Delia had been at her desk since 7 because sleeping had become difficult and writing had not. The woman who came in was a widow named Mrs. Oakes, who had visited the shop twice before to have letters written to a son in the Navy. She was perhaps 50, very thin, with the particular thinness of a woman who had been directing resources toward other people for so long that she had forgotten to direct any toward herself. She wanted a letter to the Navy office, inquiring after her son's pay, which had been held for administrative reasons she did not understand, and could not argue with herself because the forms of address required defeated her. Delia wrote the letter. When she gave the rate, Mrs. Oakes went very still, and then said, with the careful dignity of a woman who had been managing scarcity for a long time, that she had brought 4d. She had thought it might be 4d. She was sorry. The standard rate for a letter of that kind was 8d. Delia folded the letter, applied the seal, and pushed it across the counter. 4d is the correct rate, she said. The inquiry to a naval office is the shorter form. I should have said so at the beginning. Mrs. Oakes took the letter with the precise, careful gratitude of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and was not going to embarrass either of them by naming it. After she left, Delia took 4pence from her own coin purse and put it in the drawer. She did not look up. She did not look toward the back of the shop where the door to the storeroom stood half open and where Edmund Vane had been standing for the preceding 4 minutes, having arrived early and found Mrs. Fitch gone to the market and the shop's back entrance unlocked in the way it always was on market mornings. He had not announced himself. He had not intended to witness anything. He had stood in the shadow of the half-open door and watched a woman absorb the cost of another woman's poverty as though it were a matter of arithmetic rather than sacrifice, and he had felt something shift in him that he had not felt in a year, something that moved like the first crack in ice over a deep river. Not the breaking, but the recognition that breaking was possible. He stepped into the shop. Delia looked up. Her expression did not change with the particular completeness of someone who has trained themselves into composure, but he saw the quick adjustment, the very slight steadying. "The Naval Office inquiry," he said carefully, "is not the shorter form." "No," she said. "It is not. You paid the difference." "Mrs. Oakes has a son in the Navy," Delia said. "And 4pence. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on him before and did not have a name for, something between recognition and distress. The way a person looks when they encounter something they had stopped believing existed. He put a half-crown on the counter without explanation and left. Delia looked at the half-crown. It was 26 pence above the difference she had absorbed. She put it in the drawer anyway, because arguing with it would have required him to be in the room. The season accelerated in April, the way it always did, gathering speed and pressure and the specific social anxiety of a limited number of weeks in which an enormous number of things were required to be accomplished. Balls multiplied. Calling cards multiplied. The machinery of the marriage market, which was not a metaphor but a genuine social mechanism with real procedural steps and real consequences for failure, turned its full attention toward the question of the Duke of Ashmore's prospects. Sophronia had been patient until the 3rd week of April, which was when patience expired and strategy was required. She arranged for Miss Cecily Hargrove to be present at Lady Wentworth's spring assembly at the house in Grosvenor Square, which was the most attended ball of the middle season, and she arranged for Cecily to be positioned near Edmund from the first set forward. Cecily was not malicious. She was 21 and genuinely pretty, and had been told all her life that she was the appropriate choice for any room she entered, which had produced in her a kind of confident sweetness that was not unkindness, but was also not the capacity to perceive anything outside the script she had been given. She liked Edmund well enough. She did not know about the letter shop. She had been told, in the careful way Sophronia told things, that a minor unsuitable attachment had needed to be managed, and she had accepted this the way she accepted most information that arrived pre-organized. Edmund arrived at the Wentworth ball late, which was not his habit. He had been at the shop in the afternoon. Delia had not been there. Mrs. Fitch had told him, with the careful neutrality of a woman deciding how much to say, that Delia had been asked not to come to the ball, but had not been told why, and that she had spent the afternoon writing something after the last client left. He stood in the carriage outside the shop on Aldersgate Street for a full minute after that, and then he drove to Grosvenor Square. The ballroom at the Wentworth house was everything the shop in Aldersgate Street was not, which was its entire function. It was a room designed to announce itself, to weight every body inside it according to the quality of the fabric covering it, to make visible in candles and mirrors and the accumulated cost of a single evening what a season was for. Sophronia received him at the entrance with Cecily at her side, which was not a coincidence, and steered him into the company with the practiced ease of a woman who had been managing this kind of social geometry for 3 decades. Edmund moved through the room the way he moved through all rooms, carefully and with the specific stillness that people had been misreading as arrogance for 3 years. And that was, as Delia had understood, containment. He spoke to Lord Wentworth. He spoke to 2 men from his club. He allowed Sophronia to introduce him to Cecily again, as though the previous 4 introductions had not occurred. And he danced the first set with her, because declining would have been a different kind of scene than the one he intended to make. Delia's name was spoken at 10:30. It was Sophronia who spoke it, or rather, who deployed it, which was a distinction the room understood even if it could not have named the mechanism. She was standing with a group that included Lady Dunmore, Lady Wentworth herself, 2 mothers of debutantes, and a baronet's wife who had been Sophronia's particular ally in these matters for the better part of 15 years. Edmund was 15 feet away, and the room's noise was sufficient that Sophronia could reasonably have claimed not to know he could hear. "It has been managed," she said, with the composure of a woman reporting a minor domestic matter. "The paid scribbler. She is not here, you will notice. One does not anticipate further difficulty." The baronet's wife laughed softly. Lady Dunmore offered a sympathetic murmur. Edmund's face did not change. He set his glass down on the nearest surface, without looking for a footman. He crossed the room toward the door, with the particular directness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer consulting any other consideration. Sophronia saw him go. Something shifted in her expression, a single brief clause of apprehension crossing her composure before she recovered it. Edmund's carriage returned him to Aldersgate Street at 11 o'clock. The shop was dark. The front door was latched from inside. The letter was on the counter. Mrs. Fitch had left a key with the next-door printer for use in an emergency, which was a practical arrangement she had made after the 3rd time someone had needed a commission copied and framed before a morning post. Edmund had known about the key because Delia had mentioned it on a Tuesday in March, in the context of explaining a particular client's habit of early arrivals. He collected it from the printer's boy, who was still awake and regarded the request with the professional indifference of a city child who has seen stranger things. He lit one of the shop's candles and picked up the letter. It was addressed to no one. It was 3 paragraphs in Delia's clean, steady hand, and it was the 3rd letter she had written for him without his having asked for it. The first paragraph described a man who came to a letter shop in March, not because he needed letters written, but because the act of commissioning them required him to be present in the world in a way that nothing else had, and because there was one person in the shop who read what he actually meant, rather than what he had managed to write. The 2nd paragraph named his son. She had learned the name from the letter she had written to the boy, which Edmund had described to her without realizing how much he had told her. Thomas. 8 years old in the autumn. There was a piece of music open on a piano in a study in Wiltshire. The letter said that she understood why the piano had not been played, and that she understood the piece of music would wait, because music written for children was patient by its nature. The 3rd paragraph said, in Delia's characteristic way, without sentiment and without apology, what the whole exchange since the 2nd of March had come to mean to her, in plain declarative sentences that could not be misread or revised or corrected into something safer. She had not addressed it to him. She had not sealed it. She had not, in writing it, expected anything to come of it, because she had spent 23 years understanding that her perception was sharper than the world's assessment of her, and that this was not a problem the world proposed to solve. Edmund stood at the counter of the shop for a long time. Then he put the letter inside his coat. He returned to the Wentworth ball at 11:30. The season's assembled company was still present. The dancing had moved to a 2nd set. Sophronia was standing with Cecily near the center of the room, and she registered Edmund's entrance with the small, precise attention of a woman who had been waiting for it, while pretending not to wait. Edmund walked through the room. He walked with the directness he had shown leaving an hour earlier, but with a different quality of purpose, the way a man moves when what he is doing is not escape, but arrival. He crossed the full length of the ballroom. Faces turned. Conversations paused. The particular quality of his movement was audible in the room the way a change in music is audible, as a shift in what the air is doing. He stopped at the center of the room, where the light was brightest and the company densest and the quality of attention most complete. He reached inside his coat and took out the letter. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms do when something is about to happen that the room did not plan. He read the letter aloud. Not all of it. The first paragraph and the third. He read them in his level voice, the same voice he had used on the 2nd of March to describe an endowment to a boys' school in Dorset. And the voice did not change in timbre, but it changed in weight. The way a foundation changes when what stands on it is no longer provisional. The first paragraph was about a man who had needed to be present in the world again, and a woman who had understood what he could not say. The third paragraph was the one in which Delia had said, in plain sentences, what the exchange had cost her and what it had restored, and what she would do now with those facts. When he finished reading, the room was still silent. He put the letter back inside his coat and looked at the assembled company with the same level gaze he used for all things, and he said, in a voice that was exactly calibrated to be heard from the receiving room to the far wall, Miss Hartwell has my respect, my regard, and, if she will accept it, my hand. If that requires revision, I will not be commissioning it. Sophronia's fan had been moving at a measured height throughout the evening. It went still. Cecily stood very straight and very composed, and went a little pale, which was a dignified response to an undignified situation and the quality in her that Delia would have liked best if she had ever met her. She did not look at Sophronia. She looked at Edmund with a brief, direct attention that was almost, at its edges, a kind of relief, and then she excused herself from the group with perfect propriety and went to find her mother. Mr. Pell, the solicitor, who had attended the ball at Edmund's earlier instruction, stood near the door of the card-room and watched without surprise. Edmund had spoken to him that afternoon about a settlement of £300 annually, to be arranged before any further conversation, because the one thing Edmund had understood completely from the letter on the counter was that Delia Hartwell was not going to allow herself to be positioned as a matter of sentiment rather than fact. £300 annually, independent, held in her name. That was what the settlement meant. That was the clarity he had learned from watching her push a letter across a counter to a woman with fourpence. The assembled company absorbed the declaration the way it absorbed all seismic events, which was by beginning immediately to reorganize the narrative. Lord Ashmore had declared for a letter writer from Cheapside. This was either the most astonishing development of the season or, viewed at the correct angle, an entirely comprehensible choice for a man of his particular quality and history, and within 40 minutes of the declaration, the ratio of those two interpretations had shifted sharply in the direction of the second. Edmund left the ball at midnight. He drove to Aldersgate Street for the second time that evening. Delia was not at the shop. She had gone back to her lodgings in Lamb's Court, a set of 2 rooms above a tailor's workshop, which was where she lived on 12 shillings a week with a clear conscience and a great deal of unsatisfied longing. She was sitting at the small table by the window, with a glass of cold water, and no candle, because she had found that the dark was easier to think in than the light. The knock at the street door came at 12:30. She did not know it was him. She was not a woman who allowed herself to expect things. She took a candle down to the street door and opened it, and found Edmund Vane standing on the step in his evening coat, without his hat, which he appeared to have left in the carriage. He had the letter in his hand. "I read it," he said. "I know," she said. "I read it at the Wentworth ball, before the assembled company." Delia absorbed this. Her hand was steady on the candle. "I expect that produced consequences," she said. "Several." He was quiet for a moment. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, and which she was going to need time to fully understand, something that was both careful and ungoverned, like water moving under ice that is beginning to give. "The consequences I am most concerned with are the ones that depend on your answer." She stood at the door of her lodging in Lamb's Court with a penny candle in her hand and looked at Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, who had come to a letter shop in March because he could no longer be alone with his own silence, and who had returned 5 times because the woman behind the counter had seen him correctly, and who had, on a Thursday night in April, read her words aloud in the loudest room in the season, at a cost to himself that he had calculated precisely and paid without hesitation. She said yes. Not in those words. She said what she actually meant, which was that she accepted his offer and his regard, and wished him to understand that she was accepting a man she had observed closely for 8 weeks. Not a title, and that if he had understood her letters at all, he would know the distinction was not a formality. He said he had understood precisely that, and that it was the point. If you are moved by Delia's story, take a moment to leave a comment below, and tell us which letter you think mattered most. Quiet stories need witnesses, too. They were married in May, before the season ended, in a church in the city rather than a fashionable chapel, with Mrs. Fitch in attendance and Mr. Pell managing the settlement papers in the vestry. Sophronia came. She sat in the second row and held herself with the composure of a woman who has understood that the world has revised something she thought was fixed, and who is deciding, slowly and with difficulty, whether the revision might not be the correction she needed rather than the defeat she had feared. She did not say so. She looked at her son's face at the altar, and something shifted in her. A single interior clause, brief and private. Something that might have been the beginning of recognition. Ashmore Park in Wiltshire was 3 hours from London by carriage, and it was larger than Delia had allowed herself to imagine, which was to say it was very large indeed, and very quiet in the particular way that houses become quiet when the people inside them have been holding themselves apart from the ordinary sounds of living. The windows faced west across a formal garden that had been maintained, but not loved, and the rooms had the quality of rooms that have been correct for a long time without being inhabited. There was a study at the end of the east wing. In the study, there was a piano. On the music stand, exactly as Edmund had described, a piece of music waited. The pages had yellowed very slightly at the corners. It was a simple piece, written in a child's range, the kind of melody that is easy to remember and hard to forget. Delia sat in the chair beside the piano for a long time on her first evening at Ashmore Park. Edmund came in at dusk and found her there. He did not ask what she was thinking. He sat in the chair across from her, and they remained in the study as the light left the windows and the room filled with the warm dark, and they were quiet together, which was different from the silence Edmund had been living in. Different in kind rather than degree. The way company is different from loneliness, even when neither of them speaks. Outside, the last of the spring dissolved into summer. The formal garden began, cautiously, to be loved. Letters arrived from Mrs. Fitch in London, practical and warm, describing the shop's new arrangements and a young woman she had hired who showed promise. Delia wrote back in the hand Edmund had first read behind a letter shop counter, the hand he had watched with an attention he had called, to himself, professional interest, and which had been something else entirely from the second Tuesday onward. In October, 2 weeks before Thomas's birthday, Edmund sat down at the piano in the East Wing study for the first time. He played slowly, and not well, because he had not played in 18 months, and because grief does not maintain a man's facility at the piano. Delia sat at the writing desk in the corner of the study with a letter half written in front of her, and she did not look up, because she understood that some things are witnessed most kindly at an angle. The melody was simple. It moved through its phrasing and returned to the beginning, the way children's music does, without complication, without concealment, without any ambition beyond being heard. Outside the East Wing window, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. It came down in the quiet, unhurried way of first snowfalls, settling on the formal garden and on the bare branches of the yew trees and on the stone ledge of the window where a candle had been burning since evening. Delia set down her pen and listened to the music and the snow together, and she thought about a letter she had written to no one on a Thursday morning in April, lying open on a counter without a seal, addressed to no one because she had not allowed herself to expect a reader. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong, and she was glad of it. And the piano was playing, and the snow was falling, and she was in a room she had claimed.